Okay. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. We are going to get started. It is 6 o'clock, Wednesday, June 10th. You can see a couple of people still coming into the room, but we're going to get started. Wanted to thank everyone for coming this evening. My name is Jessie Jones, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Coast Watch. And Coast Watch is a program of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, and we started broadcasting these webinars during the quarantine, and we're very happy to have you with us tonight. Tonight, we have a few guests with us, and then we also have a special guest. Joining us tonight is Margaret Minnick from the Rocky Habitats North Coast group. Dawn, and you can wave if you would like to. And then there is Dawn from Lincoln City Audubon Society, and then there is Roy Lowe, who is our guest tonight, who was the leader of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. As I said, Coast Watch is a program of Oregon Shores, and we are a mile-by-mile adoption program based in Oregon. Our volunteers adopt a mile of the Oregon coast and do a kind of a simple report 4 times a year. And then we connect those volunteers with further projects that they would like to. Projects monitoring birds that are on the shore, dead birds, live birds, marine debris projects, sea star surveys, and more. And we actually have a new project coming up that's hunting a hybrid beach grass. And I will give you my contact information at the end of this webinar. Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition is kind of the parent umbrella program that Coast Watch is within. Oregon Shores deals with land use issues and really helping to preserve our coast. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end as well. But we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to kind of move through these. This month, June, our webinars are really kind of focused on Oregon's rocky habitats. We have a lot of sandy shores, but we also have about 41% of our shore is a rocky shore. Everything that you see driving up and down the coast. And tonight we're going to be talking about the islands off of that, which are actually a part of our rocky shores as well. Right now in Oregon, on June 1st, a pilot project, kind of a pilot process began where the public will have an opportunity to put in proposals about updating our current rocky habitat management that was created in 1994. And so if you have any questions about that, you can contact me. And also, we also have our guest here, Margaret, who is also working on that. And so I'm going to introduce Margaret next, but if you have questions about that, you can let me know as well. And so next we have Margaret Minnick.
Hi everyone, my name is Margaret Minnick, and I am working on forming a community group basically to look at potential new rocky habitat protections in the area north, like from Garibaldi north all the way to the Washington border. I also work for Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve, so some of you might know me in that capacity as well. If you are interested in talking about rocky habitats and looking at new protections in our area, please contact me to get involved. We have a Facebook page, and then you can contact me by email. You can see the email on the screen, and by phone, and get on a list for regular updates and invitations to upcoming meetings.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. And then Dawn is next, and then Dawn will also be introducing Roy.
Hi, my name is Dawn Biascusa, and I'm the president of the Lincoln City Audubon Society. Our Audubon chapter is about 20 years old, and we serve all of Lincoln and Tillamook counties. So about 1/3 of the whole coast is in our geographic region. We have about 100 members and a pretty good volunteer base. Our focus areas are conservation, education, citizen science, and outreach. And as part of our projects this year, we're focusing on, as you can see, rocky habitats, rocky shores. And we're going to be looking at the same as Margaret is doing up on the North Coast and Jesse's doing on the South Coast. We're looking at in Lincoln and Tillamook counties areas that could use additional or new protections for rocky habitats. So our area stretches from Cape Perpetua in the south to Cape Falcon in the north. And so anything in between there. And like Jesse said, I'll be giving you our contact information when at the end. But we also have a Facebook group, My Favorite Rocky Habitat in Lincoln Tillamook counties. Be sure to look us up and join the group and share your thoughts about protecting our rocky coast. So I appreciate so much Jesse and Margaret helping us put this together. We had already set up some presentations with Roy and some other folks this month, and then the pandemic happened, and so we had to cancel the live presentations. And so this is, the in-person, I should say, this is live. So I appreciate your help, and I also appreciate Roy and the other speakers for being so flexible to work with us. As Jesse mentioned, Roy was the manager of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. In fact, he was the refuge manager for the entire Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge complex, which includes the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. He was with U.S. Fish and Wildlife for 37 years and retired about 5 years ago, I think, at the same time I retired. So we appreciate your coming and sharing your photos and your journeys and your expertise, And so I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Oh, really quick, I just want to interrupt. I forgot to say, everyone, you may have some questions as we are going through this. And so I wanted to encourage everybody, type your questions into the Q&A box. And then at the end, we will take those questions and answer them one by one. So I wanted to say that. All right, I'm going to stop share now and let Roy go.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge and Three Rocks National Wildlife Refuge. So I'll give a little bit of background on the history and what it is and some of the wildlife you can see there and some of the management that's going on with that refuge. First, I want to just go over some of the federal lands. Most people in Oregon are familiar with the various federal lands, but National Wildlife Refuges manages over 500 million acres of lands and waters. And this is a picture of Midway Atoll out in the Hawaiian Islands. About 400,000 acres of the lands are actually marine national monuments that we co-manage or manage ourselves out in the Pacific. There's somewhere around 130 million acres in the 50 states that are managed as national wildlife refuges. National parks, about 84 million acres. Of course, this is an iconic Yellowstone photograph. And national forests manage about 193 million acres. And of course, there's plenty of national forest lands within the state of Oregon. And then the Bureau of Land Management, about 250 million acres of the lands. And most people think of their lands as the arid desert lands, but we know here in Oregon that they also manage forest land, and they have some areas along the Oregon coast, of course, your Quinn Head Outstanding Natural Area, and down in Coos Curry County, the New River Area of Critical Environmental Concern. Well, Dawn asked me to speak tonight, and as she said, she's with the Audubon Society, and it's interestingly, the Audubon Society and the National Wildlife Refuge System were both founded for the same reason, and that is to protect these beautiful wading birds, the herons and egrets, whose populations were being slaughtered for their feathers. In the late 1800s, it was very popular to wear these feathers in women's hats. It was really widespread, and consequently, all of these birds were being rapidly eliminated. And this statement here that feathers were more valuable than gold is actuality. It's truth that the weight of the feathers was worth more than gold. So there was an all-out assault on wading birds. And you can see here in 1902, 3,000 pounds of feathers were sold in London, which equaled 193,000 birds that were killed for their feathers. They sold the feathers in 30-ounce packets, and each packet was about 191 to 93 birds that were killed. So Audubon Society formed for that purpose, to protect these birds. And one of the first pioneers at protecting the remaining colonies in Florida was Paul Krogel. He got a shotgun, he rode out to a little tiny 7-acre Pelican Island, and he protected the birds out there from plume hunters. And about the same time, the Florida Audubon Society hired him and 4 other wardens to protect the remaining wading bird colonies. And these guys were paid $1 a month to protect these colonies, and 2 of them were murdered because of such great value in the feathers. But Paul Krogel persisted, and once the refuge was established, he was the first manager of Pelican Island. And Pelican Island was established on March 14th, 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt, and he was trying to figure out a way he could protect these birds, both these birds and seabirds that were being slaughtered at various places. And he realized that he could create bird protection areas using an executive order. And so during his tenure, he established 55 bird reservations and game ranges. And later, those names were changed to national wildlife refuges. And this is Little Pelican Island. As I said previously, it's 7 acres. And it was the last remaining colony on the east coast of Florida for breeding eastern brown pelicans. It had a variety of herons and egrets on it. And it was protected. And around the year 2000, a major effort was put underway to protect all the surrounding lands, because if they weren't acquired, this would be all condominiums and marinas surrounding the small island. So through various efforts, they raised the money and purchased all the surrounding lands. And now there's this nice boardwalk that leads up in the Overlook Refuge. And you'll notice the planks in the boardwalk. Each refuge in the nation has a plank and is named. And those names are according to the year it was established. So you can see Pelican Island is at the very top, and the most recent refuges would be at the bottom of the boardwalk. But look at the bottom of this photo here, and you'll see Three Arch Rocks National Wildlife Refuge, created in 1907 here in Oregon. So it was the 8th refuge in the nation. And William L. Finley and Herman Bowman, seen here, went to Three Arch Rocks to document the wildlife there. They took their wagon, a horse-drawn wagon over there, and they got stuck in this tent for 17 days as it howled and rained, and they couldn't get out to the refuge. And in their journal, they said they went into an amphibian state when they were living in this tent. And eventually they were able to get through the surf and row out to the islands. And here you see them climbing the cliffs. You see some commoners above them on the ledge. They had this really heavy camera gear, big box cameras, glass plates. They camped out on the island for a number of days. And their first visit was in 1901, and they returned in 1903. So they documented the tremendous wildlife is out there in terms of seabirds. They also documented the demise of wildlife that was ongoing. It was pretty common for local shooters, not hunters, but shooters, to hire a tugboat in Tillamook Bay, and on Sundays they would motor down to Three Arch Rocks, and they would spend the day shooting seabirds flying by for fun. And amazingly enough, in 1904, Finley got on a train. He went to Washington, D.C. with his photographs, talked his way into the White House, which I find is really phenomenal, and showed the photographs to Teddy Roosevelt. And he said, "We got to do something about this." And it took him 3 years, but on October 14th, 1907, Three Arch Rocks became the first national wildlife refuge west of the Mississippi River. And you see the refuge at the bottom here are these 3 large rocks, and there's 4 smaller rocks that constitute the refuge. about 7 acres total. And if you're a bird watcher or a photographer, you know orientation to sunlight is everything on being able to see what you're trying to compose. And so here's a photo I took from the aircraft. 2 minutes later, I was north up by Cape Meares, seen in the background, looking back, and you can see how different the view looks facing into the sun. But it actually gives it a pretty nice artistic look. But what I wanted to point out is you can see the arches in 3 of the rocks out there. So it's not 3 arches rock, it's 3 arch rocks. And if you look in the background, you can see Cape Lookout. The next headland is Cascade Head, and then the far one in the distance is Cape Foulweather. So again, here's the 3 rocks. The big rock on the left is called Shag Rock. The middle rock is just kind of called Middle Rock, not a very sexy name. And then the big rock on the right is named Finley Rock. And the small rock to the lower right of Finley Rock is called Seal Rock, which really isn't an accurate name because it has sea lions all over it. But there's some other things going on in this photograph. There's actually 2 other national wildlife refuges that appear in this photograph along with 3 arch rocks. All the other rocks and islands along the coast are part of Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. And a major portion of Cape Meares is also a National Wildlife Refuge. So this is the only place in the US where you can stand in one location and look at 3 national wildlife refuges. But it doesn't stop there. There are more designations. 3 Arch Rocks is a national wilderness area on its own. Oregon Islands is a wilderness, and then Cape Meares is a research natural area. And all these designations are so that these areas can continue to thrive as they are, untouched by us in terms of management, and they can be used for research as well as protecting the resources. This is a Shag Rock, a close-up, and I just wanted to show you what it looked like in peak years of common murres. These little dark spots all across here, black and white spots, are common murres on their nest site. And altogether, during peak times, there was about 121,000 murres on this one rock alone. And this gives you a look of what they look like up close. They don't build a nest, they just lay a single egg on the rock, and it's really, really dramatic. Here's another view of 3 Arch Rocks. The rock in the distance is Shag Rock, and this closer rock is Finley Rock. And the north side of the rock has heavy vegetation and deep soils, and consequently we have burrow nesting species of seabirds that breed underground, and one of those is the tufted puffin. Now in 1913, they estimated 10,000 puffins on 3 Arch Rocks, which I can't envision in any way. So maybe that wasn't totally accurate number, but there were many, many thousands. In 1979, there were 4,000. 1988, there were 2,700. And today, unfortunately, we may have around 50 birds. And this species has been declining rapidly all throughout the Eastern Pacific. And it's been proposed that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lists this species in the area as a threatened or endangered species. We don't know the reason for the decline at this point, probably ecosystem changes. And then here's a photo of Seal Rock, and those are actually sea lions. That's why I said the rock is kind of misnamed. There's a lot of stellar sea lions in this photograph, as well as California sea lions. On the north coast of Oregon, this is the only rock or island where stellar sea lions actually give birth. So it's not a big rookery. We maybe produce 6 or 8 pups a year here, but you've got to go to Canada to reach the next pupping site. One of the issues at 3 Arch Rocks was humans in boats literally going up within feet of the rocks during the breeding season, and birds raining off the rock in fear of humans and loss of their nests, their eggs, or their chicks. And this is the arch through Finley Rock. It's so big and the water's so deep that at the end of the fishing day, charter boats would go through the rock to give their clients a thrill. But unfortunately, birds were raining off the cliffs, and there's lots of birds breeding on ledges within the arch. So we approached the Ocean Policy Advisory Council in early 1993 about putting a buffer zone to keep boats away from the rock. And they accepted the idea, but they said we really have some data to prove this. And so in the summer of 1993, we worked very cooperatively with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we studied what was going on out here. And we documented 68 watercraft disturbances, boats getting too close, and surprisingly 100 aircraft disturbances. And so we took this information back to OPAC. They supported a buffer zone, and then we approached the Oregon Marine Board, and after a public meeting, they put in a seasonal closure. So it's only 500 feet from the rocks. It's a really small area, but it's plenty large enough to prevent humans from disturbing the birds. And that closure is from May 1 to September 15th. And it was the first marine waters closures in the state of Oregon, and it's still the only one. Okay, Oregon Islands National Wildlife was created on May 6, 1935. And at the time, the only part of the refuge was the rock you see in front of you. It's called Goat Island. It's the largest rock or island in the state of Oregon at 21 acres, but that was the entire refuge. And locals know this as Bird Rock. It's just off of Harris Beach near Brookings. And it's called Bird Rock locally because there are literally tens of thousands of birds that breed there. Over time, well, all of the rocks and islands along the Oregon coast had been withdrawn. They were federal lands administered by the BLM for they were associated with the outer continental shelf with the potential for exploitation of oil, gas, or minerals. But there are none of those on these rocks and islands. So slowly we began to approach BLM about transferring these rocks to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the refuge. And the big rocks and islands came in 1968, more came in 1970, and then all the remaining, save two, came in 1996. So the refuge extends from Tillamook Head in the north, and if you look closely, you can see the mouth of the Columbia River in the background. So the farthest north rocks are right here at Tillamook Head, and extends south all the way to the California border. Now, to be within the refuge, the rock has to be above the surface of the water and separated from the mainland at mean high tide. And that can get a little bit tricky at low tide on figuring out what's in and what's out. So I did this illustration a number of years ago to show people the green area of the rock would be part of the National Wildlife Refuge administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And below that same rock, below mean high water, would be state lands. So here's an example. You might say, okay, well, mean high water, what's that? And the only way you could really know for sure is to do a survey. And of course, that's not going to happen. So another way you can tell is at about the mean high water line, barnacles cannot grow anymore above that. So if you look at this rock where this red line is, mean high water would be about where the barnacles end there. So below the red line would be Oregon Department of State Lands. Above the red line would be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, this can't be connected to the mainland. And if you walked around this rock, you would see that it's got this barnacle ring all the way around. Here's a rock where we've got barnacles and algae growing all the way to the top. So this would be on the beach, would be part of state lands and not part of the refuge system. This was was put together by my friend Bob Bailey back in the 90s. He was an Oregon Ocean Program Manager, and he was trying to show how many federal and state agencies are involved with coastal management. And he put this together, and then later we looked at it, and this is mostly federal and state. We could add a lot of local and state, local and county jurisdiction, and this would become a very, very messy diagram. But what I wanted to portray here is when you manage one part of the ocean, you're dealing with many other federal and state agencies to effectively manage your portion of it. This is one of two rocks that is not owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is Tillamook Rock in the north part of the state. It was sold to private entities. But in 1991, we signed a conservation easement in perpetuity with the owners. And what that easement says is the owners will never go ashore here from April 1st to September 15th. And that was to protect nesting seabirds that formerly covered the buildings and the sidewalks and the stairways. Those birds have now gone away due to eagle predation, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But you can see it's still very important for marine mammals. And those are all California and stellar sea lions you see hauled out all the way around this rock. So starting on the north coast, going down, we've got Ecola Point right here, sea lion rock, bird rocks at Chapman Point, Haystack Rock at Cannon Beach, and then all the way down to Cape Falcon. This is bird rocks at Chapman Point, and at their peak there were about 45,000 common murres breeding on these rocks. Most people are familiar with Haystack Rock at Cannon Beach, and you can see at a low tide it's connected to the mainland, and it's a real attractant to humans. And we had lots of trespass issues in the past here and disturbance of birds that is now managed very effectively locally that I'll talk about a little bit later. And some of the rocks are basically just large sea stacks with birds nesting on them. So this is the Twins near Cannon Beach. On the left, there's Jockey Cap Rock and Silver Point Rock, and in the background, fog enshrouded Cape Falcon. And there are some mainland areas that are really valuable seabird breeding. These are cliffs at Nestucca Mountain, part of the state park there, and you see the whitewash where there are lots of cormorants breeding, gulls, pigeon guillemots, and other species. So where you have inaccessible cliffs like this, inaccessible to mammals, seabirds can make a go of it. The same is true with Cape Lookout State Park, further south. Really big seabird colonies along the south face of the Cape Lookout here, and lower numbers along the north face. And then this is Haystack Rock number 2. There are 3 officially named Haystack Rocks in Oregon. This is number 2. It's one of the tallest rocks in the state. There are 12 species of seabirds that breed here. And there are some very unique geese that sleep on this rock at night. They're called Samiti Islands Aleutian cackling geese, and their world population is about 140 birds. This is Cape Kwan in the background, and Pacific City is just to the right. Down at Yaquina Head, the Bureau of Land Management manages the mainland, and we've been working with them for probably 35 years now to protect the seabirds that breed both on the mainland and the rocks within the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge that surround the headland, and we've got a really great working relationship with them for protecting resources there. The same is true at Hasita Head, where the rocks offshore here are part of the refuge, and the headland there is managed by state parks. This is Cape Arago State Park. The entrance to Coos Bay is up in the top up here. And you'll see the reef off to the left there. That's a Simpson Reef. It's an extremely important area for pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions as a haul out site, and pupping for some species. And I want to note this island in the back here will be in the next photo. This is Chiefs Island at Gregory Point, right near the entrance to Coos Bay. And the Coast Guard had the lighthouse out here. They had the footbridge to maintain the lighthouse. Over time, this footbridge became, it deteriorated and became condemned. They decided they no longer needed a lighthouse and that they could just put up a small rotating light on the mainland. So they tore down the bridge and abandoned the island. Initially, we wanted to add the island to the refuge, but it's a very sacred island. It's called Chiefs Island for a reason. And so the Confederated tribes of the Sayusla, Lower Umpqua, and I said that wrong, sorry, the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusla tribe requested the island from BLM, and we went along with them getting that island, and we worked with them to try to protect seabirds that breed on the island there. These are some of the rocks at Kokio Point and Bandon, very big seabird colonies, very close to people. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. And then this is the Orford Reef, about 4 miles off of Cape Blanco that you see in the background there. This is as far offshore as we have many rocks in Oregon. And this is a major breeding site for stellar sea lions, and you can see whitewash on some of these rocks. They're also important for seabird nesting. This is Island Rock off of Humbug Mountain. This rock and the rocks out on the Orford Reef, the common murres, their eggs were harvested in the gold rush days in California. There were no chicken farms set up, so they discovered they could go out on these islands and smash every murre egg on their island and then go back every day and harvest the fresh eggs. And they sold for $1 a dozen, which was a lot of money in the 1800s. So there was a great impact from this harvest. This is Hunter's Island, just south of Cape Sebastian, and you can see a patch of cormorants in the middle there, but what you can't see under that vegetation is there are tens of thousands of burrow nesting species. Some of those are nocturnal, like rhinoceros auklets and Casson's auklets. A little bit further south, Mac Arch and their associated reef at Crook Point. really large seabird colonies here. And then you get down in Samuel Boardman State Park, down in the very southern part, and their rocks and islands are very numerous. In some cases, we have coniferous trees growing on the rocks and islands. So to understand what's going on with the wildlife on the refuge, we do surveys. And oftentimes we can't go onto the rock or we'll cause major disturbance just like anyone else would. And so we spend a lot of times in small boats circling the rocks and islands and censusing birds. And after the season, when it's safe, we can go on some islands. In this case, we have volunteers that are doing botanical surveys. So we're trying to understand the plants we have on this island because they're pretty much undisturbed. And so this is a botanical survey going on. And you can imagine how difficult it would be to count this mer colony standing on the shore and looking at this mass of seabirds. So the way we enumerate the individuals is from above. You can see here, you can actually see each individual. So photography to census common mers and some cormorants. And we use a small helicopter. We fly high enough so we don't disturb the birds ourselves. And we remove the doors of the helicopter. We have 2 photographers on the side photographing the seabirds. It's a really fun flight. It's almost like sitting in an IMAX theater, but the whole time you're thinking about just how dangerous it is using this type of equipment in this environment. So this is what our overall shot would look like of that colony. Still, obviously not countable, but when you use the photographs that we zoom in using larger lenses, and you can actually see the individual birds. So the green dots are Brandt's cormorants, and they're sitting on their nest. And that clear area around them is the distance they can reach out and peck the mers to keep them away from their nest. So that's sort of the clear zone. And then the little yellow dots are each individual mer. Now they're trying to train the computer to be able to do this counting, but as of yet, we have not been able to do that. And so each little dot you see is a click by our biologist or a technician. The computer keeps track of the numbers, but we still end up having to do the hard work. And the thing that's really nice now is we have Photoshop where we can take all the images and it automatically stitches them all together. In the past, we did that on paper and it took hours to line them all up. So this is what it looks like when you're done counting. Pretty amazing, some of these colony sites. Common mers are our most abundant seabird in Oregon. We know from banding studies they live at least 26 years, and what's incredible is they can dive 500 feet deep in pursuit of fish and squid. Which when you think about it, it's dark and there's a lot of pressure down there, so it's really pretty amazing. Beginning in the early 90s, with the recovery of bald eagle populations, we began seeing quite a bit of predation of bald eagles on seabirds, particularly common mers. And here you can see this eagle has just lifted off the island with a mer. It's got it by its head and it's mers fighting, but it's pretty much all over for this individual bird. He's on the way to the eagle nest to feed its young. Now, an eagle taking a mer like this is not really a big deal, unless, of course, you're the mer. But in terms of population, there are not enough eagles to put a damper on the mer population. But the issue that has arisen is the eagles return to the rock so often, and as the population of eagles increased, they flush the birds off the rocks and islands, and then gulls, crows, ravens, and turkey vultures move in and consume the eggs or the young that are unprotected. And oftentimes, after they've disturbed the colony, you can see there's 2 eagles perched here. They're not leaving the rock, and so the mers will not come back. And the gulls and the vultures are just having a field day here, consuming the eggs. And if you could look at this photo up close, all of these birds have bloody feet, so they've all had their meal. And again, they're hanging out on the rock instead of leaving. And we've seen this basically from Lane County all the way up north. And when we first started documenting this, both raptor biologists and seabird biologists really didn't want to believe what we were saying. They said, well, it's got to be multiple effects. It can't just be eagles. They can't be causing this issue. Well, this is Colony Rock at Yaquina Head. And 10 days ago, there were 14 eagles standing in this view you see right now. And this is what it looked like. Completely devastated in terms of reproduction. So This is a natural phenomenon. It's one no one expected. Some people had a hard time believing, and so we don't know what the future holds for MERS. There may be a much lower population. Maybe at some point they'll be able to adjust, but certainly was a surprise to us. And if had we not done all this monitoring over the years, we really wouldn't know what the impact is. So if a MERS is successful in raising a young, you can see these small young here. They only raise one young. They actually leave the rock when they're three weeks old. They're little tiny downy things, and they go to sea with their dad. The female is done caring for the young for the year. She departs, and the dad walks the bird over and entices it to jump off the rock. And in some cases, we're talking hundreds of feet up. And eventually they get the little guy to jump. Here you can see in the lower left here, this bird has made the big leap, probably thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do? And they actually put their little stubby wings out and their feet, and if all goes well, they glide to the water. Sometimes it doesn't go so well, and they hit the rocks below, they bounce, they spin, and I've seen them get up, shake it off, and recover. Sometimes they don't. Here one is just splashed down, and his dad is coming down the rock behind it. You can't see it, his dad's coming down. They get together, and then here's what's pretty incredible. We believe a vast majority of the MERS in central and northern Oregon now undergo a swimming migration to Washington and British Columbia. It's the Straits of Juan de Fuca, the Straits of Georgia, where food is much more abundant during the late summer and fall. So these guys have a pretty tough life to get started, but if they make it through their first year, they usually live quite a good time. Eagles formerly were a threatened species. Peregrine falcons were formerly a threatened species. They've now recovered. I've seen one falcon take a MER, but it's just too heavy to carry, and it had to crash it onto the beach. So they don't really take many MERS, but they do pursue things like pigeon guillemots, black oyster catchers, smaller birds. And they nest now on quite a few rocks along the coast and bridges and other things. They've really recovered thanks to protection. Brandt's cormorants is one of 3 species of cormorants that breed on the Oregon coast, and most of these birds are displaying. They've built a rudimentary nest, and those are males trying to attract a female to their site. And from a distance, they look black, but when you see them up close, they have this beautiful green iridescence, scalloping of the feathers on top of the wing, and then in the breeding season, they get these wild plumes that stick out of their back and the side of their face and neck. And their gular area turns a really bright blue during the breeding season. So really pretty cool. As I showed from those area photos earlier, Grant's cormorants and common MERS often breed in the same locations. But the common MER flies out, catches one fish, flies all the way back to feed their young, then has to return. And sometimes these flights are 20, 30, 40, 50 or more miles. Whereas a Brandt's cormorant flies out, finds a school of fish, and eats as many as it can and swallows them, and flies back and regurgitates all the fish to their young. Now, this one only has one large young, but it's pretty ravenous young. You can see it's got its entire head buried in the mouth of this adult cormorant. And if you look at this little bump right here on the back of the neck, that's its bill poking in the back of the neck of this adult. Every time I look at this, it gives me sort of a sore throat. What goes in must come out, and these colonies get wider as the season goes over, from guano, of course. And living in the seabird colony is kind of like living in apartments or condominiums. You always want to be on the top floor. You do not want to nest downhill from a Brandt's cormorant, and this common MER demonstrates why. It's absolutely caked in bird poop. And first thing it did when it left the chick behind, when the other adult came in, is went out, took a bath, and then went out to sea to forage. Pelagic cormorant is another one of our species, and you can see the beautiful colors from a distance. It looks black. It's got beautiful iridescence. And I think John James Audubon, when he made it to the West Coast, he had the right description of this bird. He called it the violet green cormorant, which I think is way better than pelagic cormorant. And these birds nest on cliff ledges, and they can lay up to 5 eggs, but these ledges are really pretty small. And so over time, siblings will knock their their brother or sister out of the nest, not intentionally, there's not enough room. So if you just sit and watch this nest all season, you'll be lucky if two of these birds fled. You can see 2 large young here, but rarely do you see more than that in these nests. And I just had to throw in another photo because of the extreme beautiful colors that the iridescence shows on these birds. Pigeon guillemots are another species you'll see on the rocks and islands along the rocky shoreline. Although with seabirds, the sexes look alike, the one on the right is a male and he's displaying for the female and she's singing back to him. And here another male came a little too close and was forced off of the rock for his efforts. One of the things I like about these birds during the breeding season is inside of their mouth lining turns this brilliant orange. It's just beautiful. And these birds traditionally breed in cracks and crevices of rocks and islands. But they also breed in human structures like in the Yaquina Bay Bridge and under some of the wharves and docks and light structures. If you're close to where they have their nest, you can see them carrying individual fish back to their sites. And this individual seemed to like sculpin. It continually brought sculpin back, whereas the nests right next to it were bringing back sand lance the entire time. So they kind of specialize. But one thing we found in Lincoln County and Tillamook County is you can see an adult leaving this burrow. We found that pigeon guillemots also breed along sandy beaches where there's a high sand bank, and they dig these burrows right below the vegetation line. And if the burrow is active later in the season, it's really easy to tell, but because you can see all of the fecal matter draining out of the burrow entrance. So you can walk along and say, oh, there's an active one. These birds typically have 2 young, and the young will back up to the entrance and then poop out of the entrance so they don't foul their nest chamber. So that's pretty good on their part. We actually have 2 species of gulls that breed along the Oregon coast, and one of those is the western gull, and this bird looks to be mostly western. But we're at the north end of the western gull range and the south end of the glaucous wing gull range. So typically in Lincoln, Tillamook, Clatsop County, most of the gulls have bloodlines of both species. There are various types of hybrids. This looks like a mostly western gull. They have 2 or 3 young. They're very, very territorial at their nest sites. So we don't want people getting close to their nest because it causes real disturbance. And you can see here, this adult is removing tail feathers from his neighbor who got a little bit too close to his territory. And if you were to if there were young here and you scared the young out of the parent's territory, the neighbor would attack and kill the young to see them as, dangerous. So very important to see back from the tummies. We also try to get people not to feed gulls. Gulls are very capable of getting their own marine food items. And most often I see people feeding things that are very bad for gulls, like processed bread or popcorn or other things. The second most abundant seabird species that you'll see in Oregon is Leach's storm petrel. Actually, you probably won't see it. Most people will never see this bird. This dove-sized bird feeds offshore from 40 to hundreds of miles out over the blue Pacific, and it only comes back to its burrow under the cover of darkness when it's very dark. So if you want to see one, you pretty much got to go on a pelagic trip and get way out there. The fishermen call them tuna birds because it's usually the tuna fishermen that see them way offshore. And their island may look like there is nothing on it, but in reality, it can be covered with burrows. So each dark spot you see in this photograph is a burrow entrance to a Leach's storm petrel nest. And they nest about arm's length underground, very sandy soils. In some locations, we recorded up to 7 active burrows per square meter. So if a person was to walk on this island, he or she would crush burrows with each footstep. So in the few times that we go ashore on these islands or do research on these birds, all of the crew wears snowshoes to prevent collapsing burrows. Black oyster catchers nest along the Oregon coast. The Citizen Science Project conducted from 2015 to 2017 estimated something like a population of 506 to 629 birds in Oregon. That's from a world population of about 11,000 birds. Great to see when they're flying around doing displays. Often you hear them first. Their black coloration that really makes them disappear in rocky intertidal areas. So it's usually the call that you hear first. They build a small depression called the scrape. They might put some pebbles or shells around it, but it's pretty much not too well developed. And what's fun in the wintertime, they'll flock up during high tides because they feed on marine invertebrates. So at high tides, they just kind of hang out. And this is taken at the Depot Bay seawall, which is a great place to see these birds. And you can actually age first-year birds. You'll note the bird on the right has sort of a grayish tip to the bill. Also notice that the pupil is kind of a dull yellow, and you can barely see the orange eye ring. Compare that to the bird on the left. You can see, you can really tell the difference. And you don't even need to see the bill. If you look at this bird in the background right here, you can look at the eye and say, oh, that's a first-year bird. So this is one of the good places to do that. The birds are really close, and you just look straight down from the seawall. There are a variety of other species that use Organ Islands and the rocky intertidal that are not breeders here. These are species of shorebirds. The grayer colored birds you see through here are surf birds. All of these birds have their head tucked, they're sleeping. The darker birds here are black turnstone, and this bird with the spotted chest, that's the smallest bird, is a rock sandpiper. And these colorations make them really invisible a lot of times on the rocks. In this case, I walked up to the site and I was intent on photographing surf scoters offshore, and I was taking photos, and this guy walked up to me and said, what are these birds by your feet down here? I hadn't even seen these birds. They were so well camouflaged, they weren't moving. I wasn't paying attention. And so they can be really tough to see until they move. And here's a black turnstone. It's just captured a nice big juicy invertebrate. And when they're walking around on the rocks, you don't notice them very well, but as soon as they fly, they flash this white color. Underneath, they're entirely white. On the back, they have some white. And so they really show up once they start flying. Here's some harbor seals snoozing away with a flock of surf birds that's coming in for a landing. And note at the very lower right, there's one bird that's really white underneath. The white bird is a black turnstone. The other birds here are surf birds. All of these birds, these three species I've just mentioned, breed in the Canadian and Alaska Arctic, and they're up there now doing their thing. This is a wandering tattler, long straight bill, basically an indescript gray bird. Once you learn their call, it sounds like nothing else. It's really easy to go, oh, I hear a wandering tattler. You usually see this bird by itself in the rocky intertidal areas. Sometimes you'll see 2 or 3, but it's mostly a loner. And then people think of great blue herons as species you see all the time around estuaries or river lakes, which you do, but some birds actually forage in the intertidal area. And this is one of the birds I see quite often at low tide at Seal Rock when there's not a lot of people around. It's down looking for crabs and small fish. And they also use some of the rocks and islands for roosting. And this is one of the refuge islands. And this bird is actually, it's a fairly cool late winter day, and it's thermoregulating. It's got its wings facing the sun, and it's drenching in the rays. This is the Rogue Reef off of the Rogue River. The rock at the bottom is called Pyramid Rock. It's the largest pupping area for stellar sea lions in U.S. waters south of Alaska. This is a species that was recently delisted from threatened to, it's unlisted now, it's recovered very well. This one rock produces anywhere from 500 pups to 1,000 pups, so it's a real gold mine for stellar sea lions. In the middle there, you'll see a large bull and then his harem of females surrounding him, and lots of pups there. So really, really cool resource. We also have lots of California sea lions, and when they're not surfing like this, they're laying out on the beach. And this is Shell Island at Simpson Reef, the area I said was really important for pinnipeds. The vast majority of the animals in this picture hauled out are California sea lions. There are a fair number of stellar sea lions in there as well, and a couple of other species I'll mention in a minute. Interestingly, the species do not breed in Oregon, and only males come north to Oregon waters and Washington waters in British Columbia. The females stay south in Southern California and Mexico, close to the breeding areas. And then the other species of pinniped we have that uses rocky intertidal in the refuge are harbor seals. And you usually don't see those very high up on the rocks. They're pretty close to where they can get in the water quick and escape. Here they are in the intertidal area at low tide. And I think this one individual really didn't want to have his photograph taken. He's letting me know that I'm violating his personal area. So some people move here and they go, well, how do you tell a seal from a sea lion? And there's a couple really easy ways if you see them up close. The California sea lion on the left has an external ear flap. The harbor seal on the right has a hole where its ear is. So if you can see the head up close, you see it's nice and smooth, no ear flap, harbor seal. And their flippers are different as well. Here you see stellar sea lions on this, hauled out on this jetty, and notice they're standing on their large fore flippers. They can rotate their rear flippers underneath them, and they can physically walk and climb up this rock. The harbor seal on the right cannot do that. It has much smaller flippers in the front, and it crawls along on its belly. So you never see them high on rocks. They're always close to the water edge. For propulsion, the harbor seal uses its rear flippers just like a fish would do, and California sea lions, the stellar sea lions, use their front flippers for motion. And then there's one more species that we have predominantly only at Shell Island and Simpson Reef, and those are elephant seals, northern elephant seals. A few pups are born there every winter, not many, but quite a few haul out there. And you notice this one in the middle looks pretty bedraggled. And this shot here, northern elephant seals, unlike the other pinnipeds we have in the state, undergo a catastrophic molt where they molt their entire outer skin and fur layer all at once. And so during that time, they come ashore and have to stay ashore while this goes on. Whereas the other pinnipeds, they molt individual parts of the body over throughout the year. So at Simpson Reef in the summertime, you can see these animals hauled out there, and they're shedding their outer layers. Brown pelicans, another former threatened species that have fully recovered. These birds breed in Southern California and Mexico in the winter and early spring, and then they come north to the Pacific Northwest, and we can actually see quite a few of them. So they don't breed here, but they do use the rocks and islands as roost sites. These are birds that are transitioning back into breeding plumage, so it's late in the year. They're typically here from May through October. And here's a young bird. I took this photo about a month ago. This bird had probably fledged a month earlier. You'll see it has a very white belly, white stripe under the wing, so it's really pretty easy to tell these first-year juvenile birds. One of my favorite ducks, it's another species that doesn't breed here, but it uses the rocks and islands and rocky intertidal areas, and that's a harlequin duck. They're one of my favorites because their favorite habitat is rocky intertidal where they forage, and when they breed in freshwater flowing streams in the mountains. So there's several hundred that breed in the Cascades, many more that breed in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. Here you see mom and dad together on the intertidal area. And surprisingly, as gaudy as the males are, they really kind of disappear in the intertidal zone when they're hauled out. Now, I got the camera focused on these birds, but initially when I walked up here, I didn't see these birds until they started moving and preening, and thought, oh my gosh, the colors match really well. Here they're molting pretty heavily, so they're not looking totally sharp. But and then there's a few headlands that we have acquired to protect adjacent seabird colonies, and one of those is Coquille Point. We worked with the city to protect this headland. It was under the threat of development. The town was marching to the west. The rocks you see are on the beach at low tide. We had trespass issues and disturbance issues. So we went ahead and purchased the headland just as one last hotel went in. And we created a parking lot, trail system, staircases so people can get up and down to the beach. And then we have interpretive panels spread around the headland so people can learn about the wildlife you can see there and how you help protect it. One of our primary tools for refuge management is environmental education, because the vast majority of the issues we have with disturbance of seabirds and marine mammals are people that don't realize that their actions are harming the wildlife. And so that's a big part of what we have and are doing along the Oregon coast. At this site, we also, a friends group established in, I think it was 1996. And so they do volunteer interpretation to help people understand the wildlife, and they do monitoring, and so it's a great help. This is Crook Point. You see Cape Sebastian in the background. This is Crook Point here. At one point, the Bureau of Land Management was considering building an interpretive center there, which really would have induced a lot of people to an area that's very isolated. And then later it went on the market and was undoubtedly going to be home sites. And there are many major seabird colonies here that are connected to the mainland at low tide. And so working with the Nature Conservancy, we were able to acquire this headland, and literally the Nature Conservancy acquired it within hours of it being lost to private ownership. So we're really grateful to their efforts. And it's now part of the refuge system. And it's always been kind of this dirt blown area on the top, but the slopes have all sorts of unique vegetation. It has the largest stand of California bluegrass north of California. There's interesting butterflies out here, lots of cultural sites. As I said, these major seabird colonies on the shoreline. So we will not be having public use here. This is really sort of an ecological reserve. For instance, our volunteers identified 100 species of marine algae in the intertidal zone here, so really diverse site. And about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a proposal to surround Crook Point with a huge golf resort. And I think that proposal is still on the books. It hasn't moved forward, thankfully. And I hope it never happens, but we were fortunate to get in and acquire the headland when we did, or it would have been lost to other causes. And this is Whale Cove on the north coast, just south of Depot Bay. This area through here was in private ownership, and the same owner owned this area as well. And there were proposals for homes, restaurants, and other things. And it's a very scenic area. So my good friend Neil Main and the North Coast Land Conservancy went out and tried to protect this land. And they spent years working on proposals and finally came through. They actually acquired federal highways funds to protect the scenic corridor. When you drive by here and see this area, it is just absolutely gorgeous. Yes, there's some houses and there's a hotel on one side, but it's still really beautiful. And so they were able to use those funds to acquire that land. And then we took ownership and management of it. Right over here is Rocky Creek State Park, and there's a trail system that leads down right to this point right here. And if you take that trail, it leads to an interpretive panel that overlooks the cove here, and it's really beautiful. So you should stop by there sometime if you're in the area. And besides being called Whale Cove, many people know it as Smuggler's Cove because this is where they snuck alcohol into the United States during Prohibition. Ships would come down with bourbon from Canada, and they would bring it ashore here. So some history as well, and cultural history from Native Americans as well. We now station volunteers on many of the lands along the coast to help interpret wildlife for the public, because you come up to a place like this and people don't understand that there's 80,000 common murres on this rock, and this is what they need, and this is why you can't get close to them. And so the volunteers love their job. They come from all over the United States. They get a free camping area in one of the state parks, and then they interpret on these various headlands. And here's a volunteers at Cape Mirrors showing a young woman the peregrine falcon nest through the spotting scope. Then Haystack Rock at Cannon Beach, I indicated earlier that it's highly accessible at low tide. And in the past, many decades ago, people were all over this rock disturbing wildlife. So we worked with the local community and a group called Haystack Rock Awareness Program to protect the resources here. And every low tide from March through, I think, October, they put these signs out at low tide warning the public what they can and can't do and how to protect the resource. And they have a dedicated crew of volunteers that are on the beach every low tide during this period, protecting the resources. It's really a great program. I think this is the 36th year of the program, something like that. And they have their own vehicle they bring out with portable interpretive exhibits. And so people really love it because they learn so much about the intertidal zone, the critters you can find there, the nudibranchs, the shellfish, and there are parts of the rock where you can look and you can see the tufted puffin. This is the best place on the west coast to see puffins, and you can see a couple standing up here before they go into the burrow entrances. So it's really been a successful program. We've used oil spill funds to get the message out. The Nestucca spill was off of Grace Harbor, and we know that they killed lots of MERS that originated from Oregon. And so we sought some of the restoration funds. We produced this brochure that's been distributed all along the West Coast, and it talks about the natural history of seabirds, but it also includes all the things that people need to do to help us protect the seabirds. And I think the original truckload, we have a semi, truck, and trailer load. Those were distributed, and we've purchased more. So it's been a really good and popular document. And the Tenya Maru oil spill was off the northern tip of Washington. We lobbied long and hard for resource dollars or restoration dollars to protect wildlife in Oregon. And we got them to produce these panels that basically ask boaters to stay away from all rocks in islands 500 feet. There's not a regulation except for at 3 Arch Rock, but we're asking them all to stay back during the breeding season. And we produced 10,000 posters to distribute of the same message, and 5,000 posters warning pilots to stay 2,000 feet above their National Wildlife Refuge when they're flying along the coast. And those who've been around Oregon for a while know that we had our own spill here. The New Carissa came ashore, first in Coos Bay, and then the Bow came ashore a second time in Waldport. And that was estimated to have killed something like 262 threatened marbled murrelets and many species of seabirds and shorebirds. And so we made a request to the National Pollution Fund Center managed by the U.S. Coast Guard, and $16.8 million was provided to acquire old growth habitat for marbled murrelets and $3.6 million for seabird and shorebird restoration and protection. And the last restoration project of that just concluded this year, and that was the placement of 80 interpretive panels along the Oregon coast. If you look at the orange dots on the left, you'll see where all the panels have been placed. Each panel is a different panel and talks about the wildlife that people can see here and how they can help protect it. So this is the last part of this restoration project from the spill that occurred in 1999. We've done some development on state park land to increase observation of wildlife and protection. This is Shell Island, a picture I showed earlier of thousands of sea lions hauled out. And you can see the old parking lot down below here. When cars parked, they actually blocked the sidewalk. There were no interpretive panels, no signage. And yet we had people climbing over here and going out and disturbing the seals and sea lions out on the refuge. So we rebuilt the parking lot and made it fully accessible, built a viewing deck. We put in this really nice fence system that's made out of cables, so when it's raining or windy, people can sit in their cars and still see this grand view of the Oregon coast. And if you go out on the deck, you can learn about the mammals that are using this site. And this basically concludes my presentation. I want to leave this next one up for a little bit. If you have questions that aren't answered during the session, you can write me at the email address above, rlowe@casco.net. If you want to talk with people at the refuge or get more information on the refuge or become a refuge volunteer, you can write oregoncoast@fws.gov. Thank you very much. I will unshare my screen.
Actually, you could
leave that up?
Yeah, maybe, I think, Roy, you had so many excellent photographs anyway, and I think it might be good for the audience to see a photo while they're asking questions. So if you do want to leave that last screen up, and then maybe we could even go back to a couple photos if anybody wanted to see them. Sure. So many excellent photographs. But yes, so we did have a couple of questions, and we'll wait for Margaret and Dawn to come back on, and we are going to take turns. And I think that Dawn, if you head into the answered questions, I did just let a couple of folks know that started answering questions that they would that we would answer their questions at the end. So if you are ready, Dawn, if you can see that, do you see that where the questions are? Okay, wonderful.
It looks like the first one was from Lee Kane, who asks, what was the impact of bald eagles on the Rocky Island rookeries prior to European arrival?
Yeah, when we think about the history of MERS on the rock, we've produced a few papers, and so you have to go back and think about what point in history are we talking about. So, for instance, at Yaquina Head, I showed this huge dense colony. That's where we did the count. MERS there. That's actually a Native American village site, and there are no MER bones in the middens there. So MERS did not live there when Native people lived there. They didn't coexist. And MERS weren't seen there until the 1920s. So when people say, what was it like historically? I'd say, well, before humans were on the continent or before Europeans made it to the West Coast. So it's a cloudy picture, but I think, and we looked at them, there's some rocks and islands where Native American people actually lived, at least seasonally. So it's really difficult to say what the picture was like. I think after we quit oil spills and quit using DDT and stuff like that, our MER population got up to about 740,000 birds. And that may have been artificially high because they were so well protected. We had gotten rid of eagles, the village sites were gone. And so that we may have seen their heyday in the mid 90s. And now eagles are coming back, and they're basically eliminating much of the breeding from in Lincoln, Tillamook County, Clatsop County. We don't know where it's going to go. Maybe historically, eagles had many more items that they could pursue in terms of fish. Like right now, lamprey should be flooding our rivers, and there's very few lamprey left. And someone yesterday sent me a photo of 12 bald eagles eating lamprey at the mouth of the Salmon River. So we know that lamprey were in huge numbers, and they probably were fed on a lot more than seabirds. Easier to catch, great protein. So it's a pretty cloudy picture. We really don't know what it was like historically, but so that's why, you know, it's hard for me to watch these MERS, watch these eagles, what they're doing in MER colonies, because I spent nearly 30 years trying to protect the colonies from people, and eagles are kind of doing things right now.
Thanks for your question, Lee. All right, Margaret, do you want to ask the second one?
Yeah, our next question is from Neil. What are the prospects of reintroducing sea otters?
Oh, good question. That is a major keystone species that's missing from our Rocky Intertidal. That's an animal we really need back because they are an apex predator. They control sea urchins, which in many cases have devastated kelp beds in California, in Oregon, and elsewhere. And sea otters are a natural control of urchins, and kelp beds are extremely important for so many different species, juvenile fish, and vertebrates. Biologically, they're really productive. So there's a group right now called the Alaka Alliance that is working towards hopefully reintroducing someday sea otters to the Oregon coast. We're the only state on the West Coast that doesn't have sea otters. They formally put them here in the early 1970s, and they didn't take. I think the technology now is down where we could bring them back, but it's a big process, and you know, there will be some impact on shellfish and commercial shellfish harvest of crab near shore and things. So there's a lot of work to be done, but hopefully it will lead to the species coming back, because it really does control the nearshore ecosystem.
Good question.
That was a very good question. So another question from an anonymous attendee. Are you going to let nature take its course with the bald eagle mirror situation, or are there plans on agency intervention?
No, there's no plans for intervention. What we found out was this happened earlier in Washington State. We didn't really understand it, but eagles recovered up there earlier, and altogether they have maybe 13 to 15,000 MERS breeding in the entire state. That's it. They have fewer rocks and islands, but and same with British Columbia. There's not a huge population in British Columbia, so there are a lot of MERS here. But again, this is a natural scenario. This is wilderness area. We're not allowed to go in and change habitat and do things. But I wouldn't know where to begin if we were going to do this. We're certainly not going to start shooting eagles to save seabirds. So it's a natural process, and it'll work itself out. And I guess from our viewpoint, our lives are so short that we only see a narrow window of what happens over time. And, you know, like I said, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there probably were a lot fewer MERS here because of native populations. And then we had oil spills and all the other things. So.
Mhm. Well, do we have any other questions from our audience this evening? Please, if you want to, you can also raise your hand and I can let you speak and ask a question if you would like to. If no one else has in the meantime, I don't know if me or Margaret or Dawn, I know that I have a question. I wonder if you could talk about, Roy, why we see some of us who volunteer in these rocky areas or spend time maybe walking along the beaches in the morning, why we might see the rhinoceros auklet, just the heads of these birds. And from my understanding, the peregrine falcons, they hunt at night, and the birds, the auklets come out at night. Is that how that works? Can you talk about that?
No, but if you see a headless rhinoceros auklet, it's undoubtedly a great horned owl. And
Oh, okay.
they almost always remove the head. And we've actually seen them out on some rocks and islands targeting tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets. And so it's another sort of a natural situation, but that's probably what you're seeing. Peregrine falcons hunt during the day.
Okay.
And a rhinoceros auklet, it's a little on the large size for them to carry. They probably can carry it, but there's not a whole lot of rhinoceros auklets in the state of Oregon.
It seems that we have seen quite a bit, and Margaret could probably chime in here too. We see, I've seen quite a few heads over a season. Of
Where at?
Haystack Rock.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll just find the head. Sometimes visitors think that they might be a puffin because they.
Yeah.
And so,
oh, right. Well, they are a type of puffin. It's puffin's an auklet, and auklet's a puffin. They're both the same family, you know. But
yep.
But yeah, that's probably what's going on. I have not heard that before. That's interesting to know, because I've been on other islands on the south coast at night working and heard barn owls and great horned owls out there calling. And in some cases, we found multiple birds dead, and they killed them and left them. I think they just saw so many birds. He said, "Oh, there's another one. I'll take that one." It's like, we don't have enough puffins. Leave them alone.
That's so interesting. Dawn, see another question? Did you want to take that?
A couple more questions. Some last name Maroney, wants to know, will Roy be on the coastwide puffin survey this year?
I think I know who's asking that question.
Okay.
I may. Well, you know, I'd like to get out and do some boat work. It's been a while since I've done any seabird boat work. So.
Okay. And there's another question in the chat window. You want me to go ahead and take that one, and then
Sure.
you can Q&A window? Okay. Kristen asks, could you recommend a good bird book that begins to get at all the rich and amazing material you just presented?
Oh boy.
There's shelves of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I can't think of a general one that would talk about, you know, the way my information is based on 29 and a half years of work along the Oregon coast. And of course, your basic field guides will help you identify birds. What I would suggest is going out to places like Cape Arago, Coquille Point, and Haystack Rock during the summer. If there are volunteers working out, just remembered with the pandemic, there may not be volunteers stationed out there. But that is a great place to get your education right on the ground, because people can point out birds, they can talk about how to identify them in flight, they can talk about the rocky intertidal and that sort of thing. So I would keep that on folks' list to visit those sites where there are actually volunteers that are willing to do interpretation. That's the best way to learn.
Well, I do know that they are out at Haystack Rock, so I know that at least.
Oh, good.
Yeah, maybe not in quite the numbers they were in the past, but just because of the current situation.
The refuge volunteers I know that we station along the coast are on hold right now because of the situation, and I don't know, I guess day to day on when that might change.
Yeah, that's sort of how it's been, huh? We did get one more question. Do great horned owls often hunt in the islands?
I don't know how frequently they do, but I know they do. And the evidence is, Jesse has seen the evidence at Haystack Rock. I've seen the evidence at Chiefs Island, at Gregory Point, down near Crook Point on some of the islands we found headless birds. And so, the rocks are so close to shoreline, it'd be very easy to hunt there. So, and of course their habitat has changed over time, but who knows how that's developed. But yeah, I think it's pretty regularly during the breeding season. This time of year, there's not a whole lot out there for an owl to pursue. So, well, I mean, now there is, but in the winter and fall, there's not much out there. So.
Nope, it looks like another, oh, let's see. Did another question just pop up? All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we may close out. Dawn or Margaret, did either of you have any questions? And actually, Roy, you can stop sharing your screen and I will put up the final
There are 2 more questions, Jesse.
Okay, that's fine. We can keep going.
So I'll ask the questions while you're switching the screen.
Sure.
Them is, why are the rhinoceros auklets in British Columbia often seen rafting during the day? And what's the difference between this and being nocturnal in Oregon?
So there are places along Oregon where if you set up a scope at Yaquina Head and scan the ocean, you can see birds out on the water, sometimes pretty close to shore. They just don't visit their burrows at night. Gulls can capture them and pull, when they come back, they have a bill load of fish, and gulls can capture them and rip the fish out of their bill. And so they're timid enough that they only come back under the cover of darkness. Now, there's one exception in the entire hemisphere that I'm aware of, and it's here in Oregon, and that's sea lion caves. If you go down in sea lion caves, rhinoceros auklets come and go during the daytime down there. It's the only place I know of anywhere that occurs. They nest in cracks and crevices high in the cave. And I think the reason they do that is gulls almost never fly in the cave, are not a threat to them. And so they've learned that. So if you want to have a chance of seeing one in the daytime, that's a great place to scope down there. If you scope around there, you'll see them. Or pay the fee and go down the cave and look. There's all sorts of pigeon guillemots breeding in there, and rhinos come and go there too.
Awesome. We have one last question, and that was, will this webinar be available on the Audubon Society website? And yes, and we can share it with Dawn. All of the Coast Watch webinars are available on our YouTube channel, but that recording can also be shared with Dawn. So I think they'll be available on ours, and then we'll also get that to Dawn. So yes, this webinar is being recorded and will be available within the next few days. So you can reach out to Dawn, myself, or even Margaret to give you the address of where that will be. And we're going to close this. I wanted to say thank you everyone for coming. This is a great audience this evening. And Roy, it's just fantastic photographs. Just some of the best that I've seen. I've heard a little bit about your photographs, but I really had no idea. There was a fantastic view of so many of the rocky shores, and that photograph of Haystack Rock. I don't think I've ever seen. There was one photograph of Haystack Rock from the south looking north that was just exquisite.
Yeah.
It really showed how it is a part of the shore. It was really beautiful perspective.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And Margaret and Dawn, I both wanted you to both close. I'm sorry. Actually, Roy, do you want to leave your email if anybody would like to contact you?
Sure.
And you can, if you want to, you can just, oh, there you go. Perfect.
Incidentally, that photograph is a sunset photo at Tokyo Point. It's a great place to go watch sunset. So
beautiful. And Margaret, would you like to share your email with folks before we close out one more time?
Sure. I can be reached at northcoastrockyhabitats@gmail.com.
Okay. And Dawn?
Probably the best email would be just email me at info@lincolncityaudubon.org, and I can get back to you from that.
Okay, great. And for those of you that are still here, a week from tonight, that's June 17th, Roy will be back as a part of a panel on the Rocky Shore management update process. And so that's a week from tonight at 6 o'clock. And if you are interested in that process and you have questions, please attend that. If you are interested, there is a webinar available that you can view, and you can contact myself, Margaret, or Dawn to get more information about the process before you come to the webinar next week, if you would like to do that. And once again, for those of you who joined late, my name is Jessie Jones, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Coast Watch. Jessie, J-E-S-S-E at OregonShores.org is my email. On Monday, the 15th, in the mornings, we usually have webinars also on Monday mornings, and at 11 o'clock, we will be having a webinar with Rebecca Maustow talking about the hybrid beach hunt, which is a kind of an exciting citizen science project that we have. The American beach grass has bred with the European beach grass, and they have created a hybrid that has been discovered. And so now there's a project happening with Rebecca Maustow, an iNaturalist, and we are looking for folks. These grasses have just been found on the North Coast in the dunes. And so we're looking for North Coast folks that want to be involved when they're doing their beach walk, if they want to take photos and upload those to iNaturalist. So if you have an interest in that, contact me at jessie@OregonShores.org, and I will send you a link. And it looks like we did we have another question? You got that one. Okay,
Well,
great.
there was a question about, somebody had asked about the ASLC website, and we didn't explain that was the Lincoln City Audubon website. So
Okay, great.
That's all that was.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Roy. That was just totally excellent. Thank you, Margaret and Dawn. This was a really fun night.
Very great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Ron.
Hey, and good night, everyone. Thanks for coming. See you next time.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.